Telsig podcast. I'm Phil Martin from the University of York. I'm joined today by Nidhi Sachdeva from the University of Toronto. Nidhi is going to be talking to us a little bit about the science of learning and how learning happens. Nidhi, I first came across you in a micro-learning conference, and you were talking about some myth-busting which you do on your blogging website with Jim Hewitt. And I just thought what you were saying is really interesting, and it applies to the broad concept, which we often talk about in this podcast, is like, how does learning technology actually help us, or does it sort of facilitate learning? Does it make it better, or does it, at what point does it get in the way? So I think your blog, which I'll link to quite a few things in the show notes here, because you've got your blog, you've got some recent podcast appearances, you're very active on social media. So we'll get some links to this, because everything that you sort of say and talk about at the moment is very current. But can you just give us a bit of your own background? Because you seem to have a lot of hats at the moment. You have a course that you run at the University of Toronto as well on learning with Jim Hewitt, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Phil, first of all, for inviting me here. It's just really an honor and wonderful experience to be speaking here with you. I know we've been connecting for some time, so great to be here. The question that you asked, the multiple hats, I think sometimes it gets tricky for me as well, but I will simplify. So yes, there's a few things I'm doing right now, and I'll go back a little bit in the history of it. But currently what I'm doing is I'm teaching at the University of Toronto, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. We call it OAZ over here. It's the teacher education sort of institute within University of Toronto, if you may want to call it Faculty of Ed. So I teach within the teacher education program, and I teach a course called Theoretical Foundations of Online Learning and Teaching. But what really we teach is how learning happens, and then what that actually means for online learning. But you can also apply that for classroom learning. In addition to that, some time ago, Jim Hewitt, who is another associate professor, actually a full professor now, him and I, we are, we were teaching the course together, and we thought, how do we continue this conversation about evidence-informed learning with our students once they are graduated from our program? Because, we need to continue knowing that. And that thought got us into, let's start the newsletter. We call it The Science of Learning. It's on a Substack. It's free. And we just started with like a couple of edu snippets. And what we do is we pick the recent educational research, some articles, sometimes it's meta-analyses, sometimes depending on what kind of study we look for. And we kind of simplify that for the teachers out there, educators, learning designers out there to be able to make sense of it, because they may not have time to read the 30-page article, but we just want to really communicate the gist of it, something that the researchers have done a really, really great job sharing that. What else do? I actually also teach some undergrad courses at another university. You said you're from University of York, but there's another university in Toronto called York University. So I teach there, and I teach some language courses there. I work with international students. I teach German language courses as well. And I do some consulting with regards to things around micro-learning. So you said that you came across my talk in a micro-learning conference. So I've some experience there as well. But yeah, a bunch of other stuff that I continue. But I think all roads in the conversation and the work that I do take me to this idea that there should be more evidence-informed sort of process. We should be, as educators, as learning designers, as instructional designers, should be more evidence-informed driven. And that doesn't happen often. And that's sort of like all of my work that I do, doesn't matter which area I'm focusing on, should be really informed by evidence. And that's probably why you also see a bunch of myth busting that I do. I don't specifically do it myself. I read about it, and I know that those slogans, those sayings, they're just so attractive, and they really take people, in numerous numbers, and then they just become so popular, but they're very, very, destructive. They can be very, very, it's not just a waste of time. They're actually very, very dangerous. So I like to continue to talk about them. So happy to get into that as well. But yeah, bunch of hats for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, your myth busting section was great. I read a few of those. So can you give us an example of the recent myths that you've busted? What's one that's sort of top of mind that's quite a popular trope people talk about, but actually isn't really based in evidence?
Yeah, so There's so many. And I mentioned earlier that I do this course with Jim Hewitt at University of Toronto. We actually have a folder, and each week we put in a new educational myth. We call it new because for a lot of our teacher candidates, it might be new. So, for example, this past week we talked about the learning pyramid, that it's a myth. And it's just so popular. It's got this beautiful pyramid with all these colors and random numbers. But if you really dig into it, it doesn't really do anything. We learn this much by doing this, and 20% by 30%, 90% by doing things. And this kind of stuff is just very attractive, right? It makes people feel like, oh, I do a lot stuff in my class and I get my students to do things with their hands or whatever. And we're like, I'm doing it. But when you really look into those numbers, they actually come from nowhere. And of course, we often talk about learning styles myth, and that we often talk about. But the recent ones that I've been really, really pushing to for people to understand that is it may not be so much of a myth as much as it is more like this popular saying or a slogan. It's like teaching facts is not important. So people believe that, and that people can just look it up. But the truth is that if you don't have the foundational knowledge within any domain specific area, then you actually can't have the necessary problem solving skills and critical thinking skills to be able to do that. So facts really are important. What they also do is that within that notion that I teach in my course of online teaching and learning theoretical foundations, we talk about the information processing model, how people learn, how knowledge moves from our sensory memory all the way down to the long-term memory, passing through the working memory. And if you don't have facts available in your long-term memory that belong to you versus uh, living in a computer somewhere or on the web somewhere, then you have suddenly really overloaded your working memory, which already is really, really limited in capacity. So without having that, new learning can't actually really happen. So when people say, "Oh, students can just look it up," well, wait, what if they don't know what to look up? You can't know what you don't know without having, learned that. So the teaching facts piece is critical. And I say that now, especially we are living in the world, we've always, for a long time, we've lived in the world of Google. But now with ChatGPT and all these other generative AI sources, I think teaching facts is important. And that's a myth that, uh, that it's not important. That is a myth that definitely we need to continue talking about.
Yeah, you've just touched on a bunch of areas there, which I'm resisting the urge to get into, because I wanted to ask quickly about the kind of students that you have on your course at the moment. Because are these trainee teachers, or are these just people who are learning how learning happens so that they can facilitate their other studies better?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So it's a really large institution. So we have different kinds of programs. We have a program called Master of Teaching that is specifically for our future teachers. So teacher candidates would be taking it, right? So they have a whole 2-year program, and they take a bunch of courses. Some are mandatory, some are electives. My course is an elective course for them. But then we also have a Master of Education program, and there's a couple of them within different sort of specific subject areas. Like it could be curriculum teaching and learning, it could be applied psychology, it could be leadership. But my course can be an add-on for some of these students who are doing the Master of Education program. They may be on the path of becoming a teacher, or they may want to get into the industry and become an instructional designer or a learning designer, or do some kind of work in that area. And then we also have a specific that started during COVID, the pandemic, an online Master of Education program. For that particular cohort, it's a mandatory course, the one I teach, because it's really pertaining to how learning happens within an online environment and what are some of the theoretical foundations you should be paying attention to. And so, but I would say a huge number, if you are connected to the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, you're somewhere connected to education and learning. So I would say lots of them are definitely educators and teachers.
Nice. Yeah. So with our understanding at the moment of how learning happens, I think a lot of this has been informed relatively recently in time. I mean, we've been figuring out how the mind works and how much information it can process realistically. Since, I guess, would it be fair to say the early 90s? Is that when a lot of the sort of psychology and cognitive sciences really started yielding data that we could work with?
Yeah, I think so. I like to say there's a few things that I mentioned in my course that I'm teaching my students. So George Miller actually said that like back in the 50s. So kind of like in many ways, we've known it for a long time that somehow he just knew, that whole idea of like we can process, the magical number 7. I think it's a
Yeah.
really, really popular article. I'll share the article with you if you want. You can share that with your listeners too. But it's a very popular article from 1956 and or something around that time. And basically it says that, it's the magical number 7. And now we believe it's like 4 to 7, anywhere in between, depending on how overloaded somebody's working memory might be. But what's interesting is that I think it was in the 90s when John Sweller developed the cognitive load theory based on the information processing model that, we process information comes in through our sensory channels, mostly through visual and auditory, and that it needs to pass through something that I think there was a time we called it short-term memory, but more appropriate word now is working memory, because the idea with working memory is that it's not just short term, that it lives quickly there and then goes somewhere else. It actually is being processed over there. So I think the working memory was a much more, appropriate name for it when it was shifted. Might have been around 60s or something. I forget. It might have been Baddeley and Stitch. I have to look those names exactly up. I did mention this particular aspect in my doctoral thesis on this topic. And then it goes to the long-term memory. So 90s was a time when John Sweller develops the cognitive load theory. And then again, I find this fascinating. It's like, we've known about the limit to our so-called short-term memory back in the day, or working memory now, since the 50s. Took us another 40 years to make sense of that, or at least took us another 40 years for John Sweller to give us this amazing theory. And still about like 30, 40 years later, we're kind of like trying to just convince a lot of educators that this is an important consideration when we're teaching. If we are not paying attention to the human cognitive architecture, to the limitations of the working memory, then I think as educators, we're really, really missing that. But you said recent. Yeah, in that context, it is recent because I think we haven't really made use of it enough, because newer ways of, what they would call it, more progressive ways, things like let students construct their own meaning on their own, and that's how we should be teaching, or discovery learning, inquiry-based learning. All these really romantic terms continue to take over. And so the evidence kind of, just gets a little bit buried. And so we just have to keep talking about it.
Yeah, I think terminology can get in the way sometimes. I think, as I was listening to you talk once about explicit instruction, and this
That's right.
might be slightly different to some people's conception of what you mean by explicit instruction. And the idea of socially constructing knowledge as well has a number of different takes. I mean,
Yes.
essentially you're talking about, when we get students together in a group and, scare quotes, socially construct knowledge, actually what we're doing is sort of facilitating that integration of new knowledge into their existing base via meaningful tasks, via social interaction. So it's a kind of like embedding. It's not like they're actually constructing the knowledge. It's more of an integration process, but we use these terms. But anyway, the explicit instruction thing was something I wanted to just chat with you, because I think that was, I've heard you explain this, but can you just give us how you explain this again, just so that we know what you're, when you talk about explicit instruction, what is this thing?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. Even just yesterday or day before, over this past 4 days, there's been some chatter on Twitter. I didn't participate in it, but I was listening to it, or watching it, I should say, and reading it. And I thought, we won't make progress if we just keep talking about this one thing. So explicit instruction, unfortunately, is misunderstood quite often. And I think there's a really popular slide that Paul Kirschner has developed, and he did it many years ago for one session. And he told me in a conversation with him, and he said, Nidhi, I just made it thinking, I needed it for that PowerPoint or that session that I was running, but I didn't realize that I would be using it over and over and over. So it's like this slide that talks about what direct instruction, he uses the term direct instruction in that slide, what direct instruction is and what direct instruction isn't. I do prefer the term explicit instruction a little bit more, because I think it's a little bit more all encompassing of what the principles of explicit instruction do mention. So what explicit instruction, that when I'm talking about it, is I'm really referring to the 10 golden principles. There were originally 17, but now we look at the 10 principles that Barack Rosenshine developed by looking at a huge body of 3 sort of areas of literature. And what he said was that this is what the master teachers were doing in that research that he conducted, 3 different areas, and they all sort of aligned with that. And there are things in that are, you start teaching and you start a class with a quick review, right? There's a lot of science with retrieval practice. We know that when we give students a chance to recap something from memory that was done before, then you are really strengthening those memory traces. They learn better. Or there were things like break down content into small manageable chunks as you're teaching it. So really aligns with cognitive load theory. So it's one of the principles. Another principle would be regularly check for understanding, right? Then that's, again, there's aspects of I can see if my students have the prior knowledge to move along, or are they stuck somewhere. They also have an opportunity to work on their metacognitive awareness through that process. Or there'll be things like do regular reviews over time, or scaffold when students need it and remove those scaffolds that when you don't. Definitely have aspects of guided student practice. And then the idea is that we move to independent student practice. So all these are principles that I'm sort of outlining here about explicit instruction. And what's interesting, the misunderstanding is that it's often people who wouldn't, let's say, know about it or have really genuinely taken the time to read this one amazing paper that Barack Rosenshine published in, I think, 2012 in the American Educator. It's a great read. And if folks could read that, that really clarifies it. And the idea that misunderstanding is that people think that it's a very lecture-based, teacher-centered, someone standing in front and just like dictating all these things. And that is far from what he called explicit instruction. He actually called it, direct instruction with the lowercase di, not the uppercase di, but the lowercase di. And that eventually was called principles of instruction or principles of explicit instruction. It is far from just being a teacher-centered thing. Think about things like this. Daily review. Who's doing that? Students are doing it. Teachers facilitating it. Independent practice or guided practice. Who's doing it? Students are doing it. Checking for understanding. Who's understanding are we checking? Students. They are always at the center of it. It's just that the teacher is not letting students just go figure it out and be overwhelmed and frustrated, because that would overload your working memory and really impede the learning process. The teacher is really there to guide. It's like a beautiful sort of conductor visual that I get, right? The players of all those beautiful instruments, they know what to do, but the conductor kind of still does the job. And that's really what explicit instruction is. It's a very inclusive, it's complex, and it's beautifully orchestrated sort of way of teaching, where it's never the point that I, the teacher, I will define everything. It's really for the student, but we're not leaving the student alone. And that's the idea. And so I'm a huge proponent of, especially when you're a novice learner, you lack, let's say, knowledge in a certain area, right? You're a beginner learner. It could be math, it could be a language. For younger learners, when they're learning their sounds, how to read, or if you're a second language learner, you're developing your skills to, know the vocabulary, the language structure in a different language. You are providing that support to the learners through this explicit sort of instruction process rather than leaving them alone. And you're a novice learner in that moment. Novices need instruction. They need guided instruction. They need scaffold. They need breaking down information. They need regular retrieval practice. They need spacing. And when you provide them with all of that and, make them really ready for that next level, maybe that could be discovery, but you really equip them with that. And that's really what explicit instruction is. It's not teacher-centered. It's for the student, just facilitated by the teacher a little bit.
Okay, so it's not sage on the stagey. It's
no.
Okay, so I think it might be just the terminology, because I think when for anyone who's familiar with sort of second language acquisition theories, and I think did you do applied linguistics? Did I see that on your profile somewhere? Right.
I did. It was a long time ago, so my knowledge of the theory might be a little rusty, but yes, I did my master's is in applied linguistics. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I did mine, and I was looking at, I mean, the theories that were, or the debates that were going around at the time were around whether explicit instruction in terms of grammar is a good thing, or whether language should be kind of acquired and we should adopt a slightly more, incidental acquisition approach. So, you provide guided exposure of students to all of this material, and, the learning will take place if you very much take a step back. And the opposition to that was how much, and I think the term explicit instruction was used, but it would talk about the explicit grammar rules that we discuss. Would we stand at the front of the board and, draw timelines with, tenses and things on there? So I think that might be, I mean, to me, that's what explicit instruction conjures up. It's all these memories of, so now we're talking, it's very much, it's more about being, mindful of general pedagogical principles, rather than, it's almost like the opposite of what the image kind of brings
I
to mind.
agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. And I think a couple of things I want to say here is, one, all this is kind of like the reality in educational research, that different areas, so we mentioned cognitive science and we also mentioned applied linguistics, things kind of like live in these silos and they don't really connect with each other. Like there are like all these vertical segments I'm visualizing, but there's not that horizontal segment that actually shares all this knowledge with each other. Because a language teacher, a math teacher, or a science teacher, they're all doing a very similar thing if you think about it, especially for learners who are learning this for the first time. And I mentioned the word novice learners because explicit instruction might look a little bit different for an expert learner. They may not need that much guidance, right? But exactly to your point, that when you think about explicit instruction, back when we looked at, adult learning theories for how people learn a second language, and we keep thinking about, explicit instruction of grammar rules and stuff, like, a little bit. I liked it, but some people might call it a bit, because I learned German as an adult and I was given lots of explicit instruction, and I speak German fluently. I teach it as well. So definitely it was a success experience for me. But some people might find it dry and think, explicit instruction of grammar. But no, Rosenshine's understanding and explanation of explicit instruction was so much more, as I said, inclusive, bringing in the learner in its entirety and letting them experience a lot of success. And we know that success breeds motivation, not necessarily the other way around. And that was explicit instruction. I want to say two things. The second thing I want to say about this is, I think sometimes the cognitive science and researchers may not have been very good with, we do bad PR, I feel almost. It's like, we pick words like direct instruction, or it's like nobody's going to like it, or we're picking words like explicit instruction. I think it's a little bit better. Or before we started calling it ritual practice, it was always called practice testing. And it's like, or the testing effect. It's like, you're not going to win the fight against things like inquiry-based or discovery. Those are like romantic, beautiful ideas. So I think there's a PR work that we also need to do, which I think is just really brings us into this reality that a lot of misunderstanding, and we're actually not at different camps. We're all on the side of learners learning.
Yeah, but I think the other twist to that as well is often these terms are differently used on different sides of the Atlantic. Like it's the same with book titles. When you're looking for a specific, it would be like, if you're studying in a North American university or looking for a North American title,
that's true.
living keyboards are laid out in different ways, which I'll never understand. But like, yeah, so I think there's probably a bit of a divide there. We might be talking about the same thing using different terms a lot of the time.
I agree.
I think it's, but yeah, definitely. I mean, applied linguistics was terrible for its terminology with things like, focus on form versus focus on forms, and use versus usage, and they're never things that were ever going to stick. So let's look a little bit on how this all links to learning technology, because we've got ways now where we can sort of chop things up more into smaller parts. We can use technology to flip things out in ways that we couldn't do before, and we can really kind of set good conditions for learning that we know students can kind of take advantage of. I think I'm interested to hear about your experience, how this works in your context and any research that you've looked at. Because the impression that I get is that universities, on the one hand, we very, forward thinking. They're bastions of educational inquiry. We try and do, but they can also be very conservative places where it's very difficult to change things. So we can get into routines of where we are doing lectures because they're easy to timetable and they fit particular schedules, and subject matter experts know about their field, but they may not know so much about teaching or how to convey this information. And a lot of this kind of really, the good teaching knowledge and how to apply these to new technological platforms to get new ideas is sometimes kind of gets siloed to a group of enthusiasts within a university or something. I mean, I know not everyone listening to us works in higher education, but this is a little, certainly a feature of higher ed in the UK. It seems like a lot of these ideas kind of have difficulty making their way into the mainstream, which is, why your Substack is great and hopefully has some impact. What's your take at the moment on universities in your context over in Toronto, but the general picture in higher education at the moment? Are we really taking advantage of what we know about how learning takes place?
Oh, that's such a loaded question. It's such a great one too. And I think I agree with everything you just said. And I think there's a very similar understanding of how you're seeing things, over in Europe and also in North America. I think there is a group of people, which is not a really big circle, and that I realize when I'm, let's say, organizing a conference and I want speakers. And then I think, oh, it's the same people. And it's great because I love seeing my friends and I love seeing my research tribe. But it's like, so it goes back to that idea that you said, enthusiasts or people who've really taken the time to do literature reading and talk about how learning happens. But then it goes back to them. But then meanwhile, the subject matter experts, they are teaching their area in university, physics or medicine or, humanities or whatever. They really know the content so well, but that doesn't automatically make them a good educator. Knowing about something is not the same as being able to communicate that to someone who doesn't know about that, right? So we know that actually there's a good amount of literature that experts don't automatically make good educators or, someone who can explain things to someone who doesn't know it. So they forget what it was like to be a novice. And I think that's where the knowledge of how learning happens, if it was introduced or reintroduced back to these wonderful group of experts of content specific experts, if that was introduced back to them, that would be a really beautiful combination. But to answer your question, I do think that it is not being used to its true potential. So I, in the Faculty of Education at the University of Toronto, teaching this one course, and then Jim Hewitt is teaching another similar version of that for our Master of Teaching students, for example. But that's sort of about it, which was what, when I was showcased along with Jim on Anna Stockey's podcast, Chalk and Talk, she really wanted to talk to us about the course. And we thought, well, that's interesting. She said, there's not many universities or not many faculty of eds that are actually doing a course like that. So let's talk about it. I think there's some in Australia. Panelist knows work's really amazing. I think it's called the Solar Lab. But there's not many. So that just goes to show that, no, it's not being utilized enough, right? This knowledge, this real easy access to knowledge of how learning happens is not something that our future teachers are being introduced to enough, or our current teachers are making use of it or tapping into that knowledge. And I think that's where podcasts like yours or discussions like that I conduct on my social space, like LinkedIn or Twitter a little bit as well, or presentations that I do, I say that. Sometimes I might find myself like, am I repeating myself too much? But then I say, no, actually, there's still a lot of people that don't know it, want to know it, and can really benefit from it. And ultimately, who benefits, Phil, is the learners, is the students, because that's really why we're doing all of this, right? I often say a teacher's success is not measured by if they manage to do the activities of that day. It's really measured by student achievement, right? And if we're not getting our students to feel that success, experience that success, and be able to do whatever they want to do in their degree courses or in their lives and their career decisions, then there's something we're missing out. So yeah, I think it's still untapped, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation, because I think whoever will end up listening to this conversation probably will get it, hopefully will get a little more intrigued and say, hey, how do I maximize, optimize this knowledge of how learning happens on top of the content knowledge that I possess to be able to do my job better and reach more students that way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think dissemination of good practice is still a kind of unanswered question. We have things like communities of practice over in the UK. I mean, again, this is probably one of these terminologies that it has an equivalent over in the States. Probably say something different. So we work with the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. We have communities of practice of educators and all these little subfields.
Yeah, similar stuff.
So it's good. It's kind of getting out there. But there was an article I was reading just the other day. I can't even remember what it was, but what it was doing was bemoaning the fact that students today aren't asked to read as much as they used to. It was one of these kind of like, it's not like it was back in our day, when you had to read. Oh God, I think the numbers. It was like 500 pages a week for each module. Oh no, ours was 1,000. I just thought, what, and I think the implicit in this article, it was the notion that, the more reading you throw at students, the better. The more robust your course is, the more robust the learning experience will be. Because if you're not, if you're being kind of timid with the amount of reading that you send on to students and demand of them, then you're kind of, you're not quite taking advantage of, you're not stretching them enough, that kind of thing. But I just thought that this was, I'm not sure what is an optimal amount, because surely the idea of, cognitive load, we tend to think of cognitive load in PowerPoint terms, I think, and, what can you display to a student, and, how do you design your slides? But obviously there's a implication in there for things like setting reading. I mean, and it can be a bit of kind of one-upmanship between, oh, how much reading do you give your students? Oh, and they're kind of trying to outdo each other. But what the students are actually taking out of it, kind of, it slips out of focus. And it sounds like I'm improvising this bit, because I only read this the other day. I was just trying to, but it's, what do we know about this? Is this something, reading lists and sheer volume of reading that we're expecting students to plow through? Is this, how could we encourage educators or subject matter experts to better think about this and what they're assigning students? Because you've also got this problem where you might set them 500 pages and some students might even do it, but if there's no room in there to even pause for reflection or to think about how the source you've just read interacts with what you read last week, then it kind of can be going in one ear and out the other. So they've technically done the reading, but it's not what you'd call a robust learning experience. So is this something that you've encountered? Is it something you talk about? And is it sort of worth questioning some of this around, sticking to reading lists for now, but broaden that out in any direction you'd like?
I haven't explicitly talked about it, but there's an implicit sort of a thing that I've done around this, and I'll mention that in a second. But I think this is an important discussion. I think I know you just read it also, and this is something that a bit of an improvisation for both of us here about this theme, but it is an important one. And again, I may, say I may get in trouble for saying this or whatever I'm about to say right now, but it is an important discussion. It also aligns with 3-hour university lectures. Like how do you actually get through them, right? So I've had this conversation, not about the reading list, but about the 3-hour university lecture with someone recently. I think it was some micro-learning discussion we were having, and I was trying to make a case for that, micro-learning doesn't have to be the shallow experience. It's about scaffolding. It's about breaking it down effectively. Really deep learning can still take place, basically. And, how can we be so sure? How can we be so sure that because we're sitting in a lecture hall for 3 hours, students are doing deeper learning? You can. That applies to a really long 500-page reading list per week or whatever. Also, just assigning reading doesn't mean students are going to do it. Students are going to do it doesn't mean that they actually have made meaning, constructed the meaning the way they should have, or the way was hoped for, or that they definitely did go through all those areas of like, oh, this could mean this, but it could also mean this, and having those rich, diverse perspective, of understanding. So just assigning is not going to do it. So I said that I haven't explicitly mentioned this, but an implicit sort of work that I did, and this was along with Jim Hewitt. So when we designed the course, we started working on the course in around 2020, and lots of discussions back and forth on Zoom at the time. And we were designing the course that the following year would be introduced for the first time. So the first cohort received the course in 2021 fall. We did a lot of thinking around this. We did not want to inundate our students just to say, hey, here's all these readings and just read, because we know from experience, all professors know from experience, that they won't be able to read all of it. So we really made it very manageable. We used a text. We work with Paul Kirschner's and Carl Hendrick's text called How Learning Happens. At the time, it was the first edition. And so the chapters are written in a way that it's just really easily read, and there's a lot of takeaways, right? And so on top of it, we might have some videos for them to watch. So it was very different experience for our university students who are, let's say, teacher candidates, to experience a university level course like that. Because you're right, we do get into this race of, oh, I assign more readings, and I burden my students more than you do. I don't think that's something to be proud of, to be honest with you, because burdening the students, we really removed the success rate possibility. And the ones who already know, the ones who already have a lot of knowledge, may be able to read faster. And we've just made sure, by assigning this load of learning on our relatively struggling learners, maybe they're from ESL background, like we've just widened that gap of educational disparity, within sort of that, outcomes, equitable outcomes, right? So we did think about it a lot, and our readings were manageable. And we actually mentioned that in the beginning of the course, that you'll see, you may think that, there's not a lot of reading each week, but it's really rich stuff. But you'll be able to engage with the content so deeply. And it's connected, and it's not random, right? It's not, oh, you could also do this, so even the additional readings, which we call optional reading, and we do notice that students tend to read that. So the week we talk about cognitive load and problem solving, that week we'll introduce a reading in the educational myth-busting folder as multitasking is not real when it involves thinking, right? You could do motor multitasking, like chewing gum and running and listening to music. You could do that, but you can't have two sort of conversations at the same time, or you can't listen to something and talk to someone at the same time. So we introduce the readings not at random, but it's like going to land on that sort of goal that we had hoped for. Now, that doesn't mean that it needs to be a 40-page article. It could be something really of substance, but it can be in less number of words, less number of pages as well. And students really, really engage. And then what do we do with that? The next week, when students come back to Zoom session, we do simple things like brain dump. Before the session begins, officially, we say, hey, you know what? Let's do 2 things that you remember from last week's reading, and we're going to do something called waterfall in our Zoom chat. And we say, just type in the chat, don't press enter. We say 3, 2, 1, waterfall, and then everybody shares. And then we go through that. So there is a moment of reflection, and I have a chance to see, oh, were there obvious misconceptions here? Or because I'm going to, it takes not a lot of time. It takes 5 minutes, right? So the point is, I assign as much as I think they can truly generate value out of and learn from it and apply that in their educational practice. But then I also take the time to get them to reflect on it, so I can check if their understanding was, incorrect or insufficient or inaccurate. We could also do Zoom polls if it's an online course. If it's an in-person, there's so many amazing things you can also do. But the point that I'm trying to make is that less number of readings, it's not the quantity that would matter, it's the quality. I know it's like a cliched sort of statement, but it really is true. The quality of the reading, but also making sure that how you're getting them to think about the content is so critical. So we do 2 discussion questions each week on our online learning space for my particular course. And those questions are so carefully thought that they will absolutely have to think about the reading. Like, it's impossible that they can't, they won't, they will. And that gives me a lot of confidence that I am keeping them on a track of thinking, but I'm not sort of deciding how they're going to think. I'm still able to see the rich, diverse background they're going to bring from their learning experience in those answers. But the question is really itself very closely. The reflection is very well thought out. Does that make sense? So, as I said, I've not done explicit discussion about how long the reading list should be, but I think that's a good sort of collection or good question for Jim and myself to work on for our Substack. But we've done implicit work on it for sure and design our course in a way that students have really commented positively on it, I have to say.
So the quality quantity thing is not. I don't think it's. Yeah, it could be a cliche, but it's definitely something worth repeating because I think it's something that is forgotten often. Not big. We just talked about the quantity aspect, but the quality, yeah. Because you mentioned How Learning Happens, which was another great book we'll link to as well. But when you open a page of How Learning Happens, it's extremely easy to read. It's because it's written by people who understand, as the title would suggest, how learning happens. And it's almost, but you compare that to the bulk of academic prose that you'll come across on, any given day these are not examples of good writing where they're designed to be understood clearly. They are often exercises in obfuscation sometimes, and I think, back to the point about the reading list is there a fear, this is pure speculation, but that lecturers, their biggest fear is that their course is going to be too easy. People are going to find their thing to it. So they want to make sure that, you don't get this? Well, hey, this is just how this discipline likes to roll. And the result is that you get these, this stack of obnoxious texts that they don't the student, I think, slips out of focus a little bit.
I don't think, in my opinion, and I was an international student in Canada when I first came to Canada, and I didn't grow up reading that kind of stuff. And you land here, so I don't think we're doing a service to doing that. So I want to go back for a second here. You mentioned again How Learning Happens, and you open a page and it's so easy to read. Now you think about Paul Kirschner for a second, and Carl has been an English literature teacher for a long, long time. And he can write really good. I know that, like, very beautiful, right? So How Learning Happens is another example of it. But because it's easy to read and easy to understand, that shouldn't be ever seen as a downside of it. You know what I'm saying? So think about Paul for a second, and it's like, can't he write? And he probably has at some point in his life, like, those sentences in research papers. It's a very complex sentence, and then it follows. It says, in simple words, and it follows yet another incomprehensible sentence. And it's like, but who are we really writing for? And that's what academic research ends up becoming. It's like written for people who know so much about these words and these terms, and they just use them. But then it's almost like an outsider can ever become an insider. And that's not how educational research should be. Classroom teachers are not reading like that. They're not teaching our students like that. Then why are we writing like that? It's like I've done this discussion with Holly Kirby. She has a subtract called The Bell Ringer, and she talks about, I think, science of learning within the context of math. Math's another area that's really dear to me, so I talk about it a lot. And we were talking about that, how educational research lives in these ivory towers. And I think it also lives with these big words that people won't be. And that was another reason we wanted to start the Substack. Let's just simplify this. What does it really mean? And this was an important discussion for me when I was writing my doctoral thesis, Phil. I did not want to write it just for 12 people. I really wanted to write. And I had this sort of, tiny little dream of mine that if I write this thesis, sure, I'll get the degree, I'll defend it, and it'll be nice, I'll get the title. But I wasn't just writing for the 12-ish number of people that may just download and really will get it. But I wanted it to be for everyone who would be interested in how learning happens, and if they wanted to do something with regards to micro-learning within online learning, online formal courses. That was sort of the specific area that I tackled within my doctoral research. But I wrote it in a way that if you pick it, I mean, you know a lot about education, but if someone who doesn't read regularly, like research papers within cognitive science, can really understand that. I've explained every term. I've written and that doesn't make it like sort of cheap or unimportant. In fact, occasionally I go on this thing called T-Space, that's sort of University of Toronto, where my thesis was posted, and I can actually see stats. I don't know the exact number right now, but it's been thousands of downloads. And I did not think that would be the case. I just thought I just wanted more than 12 people to read my thesis because it's good content in there, not because I wrote it, but because it's good knowledge in there. And I didn't think it would be thousands. Why do you think it's thousands? Because people can understand what I wrote. And I wrote it in a simple way. And writing simple is really hard. It's so much easier for me to speak my jargon and just move on with my life. But it's, you know how we say, explain it to me like I'm a 6-year-old? That's so hard to do.
Yeah.
I think kudos to that. And I think that's what we should be doing. It aligns with cognitive load. It's more inclusive. It's more equitable. We are thinking about our international students who speak English as a second language. We're thinking about cultural backgrounds who may not know these jargons. I think we're doing a real service as an educator when we write simple, right?
I want to do another. Yeah, no, I agree. But I want to. I've got another cliche on the tip of my tongue. It's who said who said I wrote a long letter because I could be bothered to write a short one. I want to say Orwell, but I don't think it was Orwell. No, we'll look it up and I'll fact check.
Yeah, I'm not sure what this
But
one,
yeah, it totally makes sense. And I think I just. But congratulations on getting thousands of downloads from your PhD. That's incredible. Wow.
Yeah.
How does that
and I
compare?
get messages from people who I don't know, like on LinkedIn sometimes, like, oh, I just finished reading your thesis. And I'm like,
Oh.
wow. And it became a topic of kind of like a book study within a learning community. It's originated in India, but they have learning sort of designers across the globe now. There's lots of them from Africa, for example, lots of them from Southeast Asia as well. And they were discussing. So I said, let me join the WhatsApp group where you actually have these chats, right? And I had a chance to present to them one day as well. And I was going through these chats. They were just they knew that I was in there. It wasn't like I was like this, sneaking in, just trying to see what people are saying about my thesis. But it was more like these questions that I thought to myself, oh, maybe I should read my thesis again, because these are some really interesting, things that people are taking out of it. And I really do think that it has something to do with the simplicity of the messaging, to write for everyone, not just to write for the few, in club members. Like that's pretty exclusive if you think about it, right? It's not the privilege. It's to give everyone that privilege, bring them into that circle, and I think that was a conscious effort that I made.
Yeah. So I think all this makes total sense to people who'll be thinking that I keep bouncing back to academia, but definitely it can descend into this kind of closed club, or you want to join the club, or you have to, you have to write like this, and you have to read 500 pages of this kind of stuff each week.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think a lot of the messaging around, what we're talking about, how learning happens and how to optimize your teaching so that students actually get stuff out of your courses is it's important. And it's every time I watch presentations like your one on the microlearning conference, it's just so refreshing because it's great to have it reinforced every now and again. And yeah, like hopefully it does spread. But I wanted to just jump in and ask you a question about impact. So you talk a lot about stats, and this is evidence-based knowledge. What do we know what works? How do we know this works? So it's really great to have empirical data about teaching techniques. Maybe we're looking at control groups, controlled experiments. We're looking at large-scale longitudinal studies. How do you think about the impact of knowledge and teaching that goes beyond sort of assessment that we tend to carry out at the end of courses and things like that? Because obviously that's quite a proximal way of measuring whether learning's taken place. We'll have some learning outcomes, we teach a little bit, and then we test the extent to which students have absorbed what we're trying to teach them. Are there any types of learning that this misses? Because it strikes me that there could be quite a lot. And if we're really looking for impact, there are kinds of impact which is kind of difficult to quantify a little bit, but are actually quite valuable. And I'm thinking of things like, you might read a novel, for example, with nothing to do with anything academic, and it gives you knowledge about a part of the world. It gives you empathy for characters that you wouldn't normally relate to. And it might subtly influence decisions that you make in life later on. So in this sort of sense, we can say that learning is taking place, but there's a lot of incidental learning that we pick up through, less modular based instruction, and they are kind of difficult to capture. So what do you think about the kind of like idea of lifelong learning, long-term? Can we be too focused on short-term metrics sometimes? And how would you measure some of these kind of more abstract forms of learning that can take place? Sorry, that's a really tricky question to land on.
It is a tricky question, but it's a great one. Oh, you know what? I'm gonna share with you a link, and you should share that with your listeners as well. Daniel Willingham, who is a really amazing cognitive scientist. Of course, you know of him. He's written a book called Outsmart Your Brain, and also Why Don't Students Like School, and among other lots and lots of amazing articles for the American Educator. And he writes Ask the Cognitive Scientist blog. He's phenomenal. He was in Toronto to deliver the keynote at the Research Ed conference as well, actually. So that was our good fortune to have him. He recently did the commencement speech, and he talked about lifelong learning. And I think this is interesting because Daniel Willingham does often talk about, the usual metrics. He doesn't talk about that, but this idea that how learning happens based on, how we are viewed in terms of our transcripts, and that helps us get a job, and those measures that. But then he actually talked about lifelong learning and how that's just going to continue going on, and there's a place for that, and that's just such an important thing too. But you ask, how do we measure that? That's a really tricky question to answer. But I do think that people's quality of that lifelong learning is influenced by what they have also learned in those, let's say, controlled environment and those metrics, because the more successful they are in that particular area, where they get a better job, or they have a degree that's exposed them to so much more travel, they automatically will also have a more richer, more diverse, more deeper opportunity to have those lifelong learning experiences as well, based on what they're exposed to, right? But I think they're both really, really important. There are areas, for example, I think aviation pilots, right? Like, you want them to pass that test if you want to sit in that plane that a pilot, you know what I'm saying? Medicine. You want those doctors who are going to be treating you and prescribing those drugs to you to know in what quantity that drug should be prescribed to you. So those metrics are really, really important. Sometimes the stakes are really, really high. But then, you read a novel and you get a different perspective to life, and you attend a beautiful talk, and you didn't go there knowing what you will. I was recently at an amazing talk, and they were talking about this idea of class in education, or this idea of equity in education. And the speaker there was talking about, there's lots of things we do about things in equity that are high on optics but low on impact, right? Now, I had the opportunity to go, and I'm like, oh yeah, like, I'm applying this knowledge, but my exposure has already taken me to that talk. Do you know what I'm saying? So my in-school learning has actually made the path for my lifelong learning also possible, right? So you going to a top university is creating a very different path for you. So I think one feeds into the other and back. It's kind of like, so I think both things are important. Some metrics are really important, as I said, where the stakes are high, but lifelong learning is what really keeps life so exciting, keeps us so refreshed, and reminds us that, sometimes we do change our perspective based on how information, like, I believed in things when I was growing up in India, and after having lived in Canada for about 17 plus years, I've changed my perspective about certain things, and that doesn't make me wrong back in the day. It's just my perspective was very different, and I learned about newer things, and that is what lifelong learning is for me, right? And I think I'm trying to be a better version of myself each day, at least. But what I learned in school did actually carve that lifelong learning path for me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I think when I just really, I like the idea of metric-driven actions, or metric-driven instruction, and any decisions we make.
Mm,
Yes, show me why
mm,
you think this is a good idea, and it's always
mm,
a valuable
mm,
conversation to have. It was,
mm,
as I was reading some of this, I was just thinking, can we take this to, because you could say, I think wider reading is a really great thing to include on my course. I'm going to do it, and
mm.
someone might say, well, show me the impact, show me the evidence, why should we do this? And you might end up
Yeah.
kind of defenestrating really valuable parts of your course that complement the more metric driven side of things,
Mm.
because you can't immediately show that this is going to yield results, especially by the
Mm.
end of the semester. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. Yeah. But I was reading, you're right. You're right. I was reading, I think there was a statistic. This is specific to the teacher exposure. I think the exposure of a teacher stays with a student for 2 to 3 years. It was a really great paper. I think it was Dylan William who had said, I'm paraphrasing here, so his words were a little bit different, but the impact, you won't probably see it immediately, right? And that goes for learning also. So I learned something today, and the metrics is one thing, and I may not be able to say, but it's going to. I have a degree in occupational therapy from India. I have a degree in applied linguistics. I have a degree in education. My PhD is in education. But that gives me the opportunity now to also look at some of the healthcare patient education work. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's like some of the stuff that I learned about how we should be communicating knowledge with patients, I couldn't actually put it in words when I learned it, but now I can. So it's kind of like that impact is, I'm seeing that impact so many years later. So anyway, it may not be as aligned example here, but feel free to cut it out if you don't want this on here. But yeah, I think the impact sometimes is seen a little bit later on.
Yeah. But so one of the things I did have on my list was you're really interested in micro learning, and this is a
Mm,
big thing that you've been pushing forward. And this is part of, to me, this is one of the great advantages of learning technology and being involved in learning technology. Is it kind of gives us this ability to do things that we couldn't do before. So on the one hand, you might, for people who are sort of scanning the horizon for new tech and going to conferences and finding different ways of doing things, we can get a bit carried away and just kind of like, that's so shiny, I want that on my course. And we tend to forget a little bit about, whether or not it's actually helping learning. But micro learning is one of those things that really does, I think, make things a bit more digestible. It has a great way of just providing this kind of scaffolding and all the things that we've been talking about. So can you give us a little bit of an overview of that and what you're doing with that and how it helps?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. This idea of micro learning. Having said using the word, I do want to say, it's just really good learning. That's what it is, right? It's not micro learning is good. Good design,
Mm,
well designed learning um, is what we're all trying for. And if we want to package it in a term called micro learning, I think we're going to be good with that. And I do mention this in my thesis also, that it's not so much about the label as much as it is about how you design it, right? So micro, just by virtue of the word micro in it, it's like, short, sweet, but where does that actually connect to? It's not so much how long it's supposed to be, but it's that idea of mental complexity. And am I paying attention to the cognitive architecture that humans have? It's just what we have. The working memory limitations are not made up. Because the truth is, just micro does not ensure that good learning will happen. But good learning design will ensure that micro learning will land, right? Because I can confuse people in 30 seconds also. Does that make sense? So I always want to clarify that the micro part is really the mental complexity and not just the short part of it. Now, you mentioned the word technology in there. I think it just so happens that in the world that we're living in, and since the word has been coined, I think around 2002, my dear friend, actually, now I know him, so I can call him my dear friend, and we can connect regularly. Theo Hug, he's actually at University of Innsbruck. He came up with this term, and there was interesting circumstances when it happened, and he called it microlearning, not knowing what it will become in the future, not thinking about it, but he called it. I thought it was a genius move. But technology just kind of like comes with it, right? Because since it's been around, the term by itself, we've had, the RSS links or Web 2.0 websites, and now we are really looking at a very different, there's platforms like 7tabs that I've worked with, or short videos, YouTube, Khan Academy. Like there's all these things, what's the idea of Khan Academy, for example, in the beginning? Oh, someone's not making sense of this concept. Let's break it down and explain them in an explainer video. Break it down. It's a 7-8 minute video. Students can understand it, right? So micro learning is really good learning principles if done well, and technology is truly there to support it. But you also said that shiny thing, right? The shiny new thing can take people's breath away, but it doesn't make it for good learning if we don't take the theoretical structure with us, right? We got to take things like, what's my instructional purpose? Why am I doing it? When am I going to do it? Is it aligning with space learning practice, or is it just the shiny thing and I'm going to wow my colleagues and my students, like, cool? Or is it like, does it really need to be a video, or can I just make a short paragraph and my face will do the trick? So I think there's a lot of the stuff that we want to be thinking about with regards to microlearning. But yes, technology is truly there to facilitate that process. But technology is also there to take us on the wrong path once in a while. And that's why going back to the theoretical foundations can help us, stay on track and not get like persuaded by, oh, the sparkles there, oh, the shiny glitter there, right? Choosing technology shouldn't be based on its newness or its exciting sort of appeal to learners. It should be based on things like instructional purpose, what level of interactivity, what theoretical sort of thing I'm trying to achieve from it. Is it space learning? Is it interleaving? Is it I'm getting them to do some kind of retrieval practice, things like that, right? So, but AI platforms of all sorts have made it actually much more possible. But just having knowledge of educational technology won't be enough. Just having knowledge of science and learning won't be enough. If you want to bring in the two together and create good micro-learning, effective micro-learning experiences, I think both should always be in front of us, and we should be making decisions based on both those aspects. Does that make sense? So it's a lot to know, actually, which I know I'm not sure if a lot of people might be thinking about it and then say, oh, I did this and it can't. Micro is only micro for the consumer. It's not micro for the person who's creating it. It's a lot of work to create a short video because, again, that's the idea. Writing simple is not that easy. It is easy to read, but it's not easy to write. Creating micro lessons are relatively easy to consume because that's the point, but they're not necessarily easy to create. The scripting part of it, creating part of it, connecting part of it, branching part of it, a lot of thinking. And that takes a long time. And teachers would say, oh, I did all this work, but it didn't land. It didn't achieve. And I said, the instructional purpose may have required something else, right? So tech alone can't do it. Science and learning alone can't do it. If we are thinking about educational technology in the context, I think both of those intersectionalities are important for us to deeply think about it. There's a lot of thinking ahead of creating, I would say.
Yeah, instead of shiny thing, I've also used hammer nail syndrome, where you just, if you've got a new subscription, and I'm just going to use it. Everything looks like a nail, so I'm just going to use it.
Yeah. It's risky. It's risky. It's a lot of wasted time for a lot of people in that case. Now, sometimes it might just, by luck would have it, you'll get it. And it will be like, yeah, this is amazing. And so this is something that I did in my doctoral thesis, right? I really wanted to understand in an online course, what kind of micro-learning experiences would students be connected to, right? Or would students be interested in? So I wasn't just working with videos. I did lots of different kinds of platforms. And I wanted to understand, like, was it the way the content was presented that appealed to them, or was it the tool because they could use it on their mobile device that was attractive to them? So I was really trying to study it from various parameters actually, and what I learned is that it wasn't that or this. It really came down to few important things like, what's my instructional purpose? Choose the technology based on that. When am I going to do it in the course? Choose the technology based on that. How am I going to present it? And what's the sort of reason for it? I guess instructional purpose would take care of that. And so it wasn't like students would say, oh, I love this micro lesson because you use that tool. They never said that. The content was always so key. And so I think there is a very complex relationship of a lot of things. If folks do end up reading or going through my thesis again, I do talk about 6 micro-learning principles that emerged from my discussion with my participants and the data that I collected. So there's some quantitative data, there's qualitative data, and the 6 instructional principles had nothing really directly to do with technology, but it's the underlying way of thinking. And that can help us make those. They're really guiding principles. They're not, this is how you should do it, but it's like, think about this and then choose that. Think about that and then choose that. And I think that was interesting for me. But again, sort of very long answer, probably. Apologies for that. But technology can optimize that process, but technology can also infuse that process. So we have to be cautious.
Yeah, no, I think, I've got a couple more, a lead-on question from that. I'm just conscious I'm not going to get evicted from my studio in a minute, so I'll be, I'll bring us into land in a sec. But
right.
you've been amazing with your time. Thank you so much for this. But I wanted to get, there were some huge questions here that I'm going to resist asking because they're just, I'm going to pull out a big thread and maybe one for another time. But I think I really wanted to sort of get your take. So you're really interested in applying what we already know about good teaching to teaching itself and to the real world. You're a teaching practitioner first, or have you got a research hat?
Definitely more of a teaching practitioner, an advocate as well, but I do have a research hat as well. I mean, of course, having to do a PhD, definitely you engage deeply in a research study. But it just so happens Jim Hewitt and myself were actually conducting a study right now, and it has something to do with retrieval practice. So we have the opportunity to explore that. And I'm also doing a research study within the umbrella of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, so SOTL. And in there, I'm looking at the impact of a certain group of micro lessons that I developed for our international students. And if they directly helped students, APA is like a big problem for a lot of our international students. It just gets and it's boring, but it's so important how to do the style guide APA when they have to submit their research papers or essays or whatever. So I've developed a set of micro lessons on APA because I tried so many different ways to teach them, and it just was not landing. So right now I'm in the process of collecting data and comparing their work pre-micro lesson and post-micro lesson to see if actually that created a change in their understanding of how they should be implementing the style guide in their research papers. So long answer, but the short answer to that is teaching practitioner definitely is a bigger part of my work, but I do try to stay within the research work as well. And the other part of research is that I guess I read a lot of secondary, even if it's not my research, I read a lot of research that's conducted by someone else and then write about it as well. But hopefully continuing to conduct my own studies as well, which is happening right now as we speak.
Yeah, I think there's an appetite for a lot of our audience, especially those involved in teaching, to kind of get out there and do their own scholarship or do their own research. And we talk about practitioner research a lot here. Time's a huge thing, though. It's just, almost by definition, when you are teaching and all the associated work that goes along with it. I've had a couple of people on the show before. I've asked this question. I'm like, how do you do it? How do you kind of get into that rhythm? So do you have any kind of advice people who might be thinking about doing a PhD, especially those involved in learning technology and trying to find out what works? Are there any kind of interesting areas that are worth exploring at the moment that people involved in teaching and learning tech there's opportunities for manageable studies and research that they could be getting on with?
Yeah, I'm a big believer of, and I agree with you, like the time, it's just, there's so much to do, which I think is a blessing. If you have lots on your plate, it's a sign that you're onto some kind of right path and people want to hear from you. People want to read what you write and you're teaching. So it's a good sign, but it is a tricky thing. It can be. And I don't use the word busy lightly. I don't like the glorification of the idea. Personally, because I think, there's that piece as well. But if people are thinking of doing it, I say rather than trying to venture out independently, sometimes what really works is that you find an expert in the field, connect with them. There's always a person on the other side of an email address. I mean, you connected with me, I replied, I write to someone, they reply. It's a beautiful feeling. Rarely it happens that people won't reply, and that's fine too. They may have their valid reasons. So if people are trying to, get into the space of research as well while teaching, scholarship of teaching and learning, design-based study, those are some really great areas. I think doing it with someone who's already done that's probably a much less daunting task than doing it all by yourself. So here's an example, writing a book, for example, right? If I want to do it, I think I would want to do it with someone, you know what I'm saying? So similarly with research studies also, connect with someone depending on what your area of interest is. Maybe if it's educational technology and the intersectionality of science and learning, or if it's ed tech within online courses, like the way I did was micro learning within online graduate level courses. And so find the people first and then venture out rather than, just go all on your own with a little backpack. And, that's kind of like, that's the risk with discovery learning. It's exciting, but you may get lost, but highly likely you won't get lost if you take someone with you who can guide you every so often, right? So starting to do it with someone, and as you gain more confidence, as you gain more experience, then you could probably do it yourself too. I recently had the opportunity to write a research paper with some colleagues in Australia. I didn't know them. We connected through LinkedIn, and we had like a 16-hour time difference. We'd meet at random times, mine 6 o'clock in the morning, and theirs 9 o'clock at nighttime or something like that. And we wrote a paper together. Now, if I had to write the paper myself, I'd be really scared, right? Or I may not even do it. But there were 3 people involved, and we actually wrote it, and we've submitted to a journal, and let's see. Hopefully, fingers crossed, it gets published. And it's sort of like the connection between healthcare, education, cognitive science, cognitive load theory, and how we can, disseminate knowledge for patient education. So find the people. I think the company you keep and the people you work with, they can really, really guide you. And again, I always say to people, we always feel nervous writing that email, but there is a human on the other side of that email address.
Yeah, well, that is great advice and a great place to finish here. So, Nidhi Sachdeva, thank you so much for joining us. Be great to have you back on again sometime. And there's so many things.
Anytime, you let me know. I really enjoyed this conversation. This felt so organic, so natural. Just sharing the little bits that I know and learning from you, and open to what folks might have to share who would listen to this. I think that's in that spirit of lifelong learning also, right? Our what we know, that sort of that exposure is defined from the place where we're starting from. So it was an honor. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much, Phil. I really enjoyed it too.